Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. Thank you so much for joining us today on this important conversation on Sino-Russian partnership in Central and Eastern Europe. This event is part of CEPA's efforts to analyze the evolving levels of Russian and Chinese malign influence across the transatlantic space. And we have a fantastic lineup for this discussion. Before I introduce them, I'd like to thank the Russia Strategic Initiative for their support of this project. And I have to say, this event was funded by the Russia Strategic Initiative, US European Command, Stuttgart, Germany. Opinions, arguments, viewpoints, and conclusions expressed in this event do not represent those of RSI, US EUCOM, the Department of Defense, or the US government. This event is cleared for public release. I'd like to thank our fantastic senior fellows joining us from the UK, Bobo and Edward Lucas, whose recent report titled Partnership Without Substance, Sino-Russian Relations in Central and Eastern Europe are the basis for today's discussion. Joining them to talk about their report and their own work are Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, the China reporter at Axios, and Mira Milosevic-Uresti, senior analyst for Russia and Eurasia at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid. Last but not least, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Matthew Buleg, research fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in London. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you take it over from here.
Thanks a lot, Geisha. I'm thrilled to be here. Welcome, everyone. Good day, wherever you are. We will hear from our panelists first, and after which we will move to a moderated Q&A discussion. So don't forget to ask your questions by using the Q&A module on Zoom, and feel free to jump in through the Q&A function at any time. So as Geisha mentioned, this event comes in the context of a recent research paper by Edward and Bobo that I hope you have all read. Not least because it sort of touches upon the lesser traveled road of the Russia-China relations and looks specifically at the reality of policy coordination or discoordination between both powers in the Central and Eastern Europe region. It's important to decipher the reality of these relations in a way, as well as their impact on the transatlantic community and the wider European security. I will ask the panelists to keep their remarks short to around 5 minutes, after which we'll move to the Q&A. Let's jump right in. Edward, I'll leave the floor to you. Can you give us an overview of the nature and the extent of the Russia-China cooperation in Central and Eastern Europe? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthew, and thanks to everyone for hosting it and for all the work they've done on this report. In a way, I'm not sure I need 5 minutes. I'm going to give most of mine to Bobo, because what was really interesting for me was finding out the lack of substance behind the headlines here. And I think we often approach this as if it was some kind of geopolitical thriller or board game. I'm sure many of us have played these kind of board games like Risk and Diplomacy, where you form alliances to do in the other side, or you write the plot of a thriller and you think, well, of course it makes sense for Russia and China to get together and do in the West, in Central Asia or Eastern Europe or wherever. But life's not like that. It's both sort of more boring and a lot more interesting. And Bobo will talk at more length about what this Russian-Chinese relationship really is like. What I did was to drill down on some of the countries concerned, Serbia, Belarus, and Hungary in particular, where there seems to be a lot of Chinese influence. And the two things that leapt out at me was that, one, there is really no friction. You might assume that Russia would be a little bit annoyed at seeing China making headway in these countries where Russia has had some quite good positions, both economically and diplomatically in recent years. But no, there's no sign of friction. And the other thing that was really striking was how one-sided this is. This is tremendous. At a sort of performative level, if you're Vucic, Orban, or Lukashenko. And so we've seen all this sort of stuff about let's put up a statue to Xi, brother Xi in Belgrade and so on. But of course, the really important thing is no one's putting up statues to Vucic and Orban and Lukashenko in Beijing. It's very much a one-sided thing. This is a way for these autocratic leaders to do some geopolitical grandstanding at home, possibly to try and extract some concessions from either from the West or from Russia. But there's no there. In the end, this is kind of giant strategic nothing burger. So that was my big takeaway, and I'm going to straight over to Bobo to give us his view of what's really going on.
Yeah, so, well, thank you very much, Edward and Mathieu. Look, just to support what Edward has just said, really, I was just struck also, like Edward, just how insubstantial the Sino-Russian relationship is in Central and Eastern Europe. But before I get to that, I just want to talk briefly about the general relationship first. There's no doubt that the Sino-Russian partnership is strong, it's multifaceted, and it's certainly highly resilient. And when Putin says relations are better than at any time in the two countries' history, he's not lying. It's true. However, the Sino-Russian partnership is a classic great power relationship. What do I mean by that? It's really driven much more by common interests than so-called shared values. It's really a prime example of mutualism in action, because it brings political, security, geopolitical, and economic dividends to both sides. However, for all the talk about an alliance, a quasi-alliance, a pseudo-alliance, China and Russia are strategically autonomous actors. And contrary to what you hear a lot of these days, they actually have different attitudes and approaches towards the international system. And until now, there's been remarkably little substantive coordination between their respective foreign policies. And this brings us to Central and Eastern Europe, because their cooperation is especially limited in this region. Each side does their own thing. They pursue their own objectives with little reference to the other. And neither side has much interest in developing a common agenda in the region. Although, having said that, they are careful to ensure that their public messaging is consonant. Now, contrary to some recent claims that I've read, there is no evidence to suggest that the Russian military buildup on the Ukrainian border was coordinated with China. Putin's actions were motivated by a specifically Russian agenda. They were not there to run interference for Beijing's activities in the Western Pacific or around Taiwan. It's similarly implausible to imagine that China would allow itself to be implicated in a potential confrontation in Europe. Now, it is conceivable that China and Russia could step up their bilateral engagement in Central and Eastern Europe as part of a larger strategic convergence looking ahead. But I think over the next few years at least, this region will remain a backwater of Sino-Russian interaction. And I think this idea that, you often hear that Russia is increasingly dependent on the Chinese, is enthralled to China. Well, I think these fears are exaggerated, because Putin remains committed to his strategic goal over the last 2 decades, which is to position Russia as an independent center of global power. And that means being beholden neither to the West nor to China. And in the meantime, I think Beijing will continue to handle Moscow with care, because it's aware of Russia's considerable disruptive capacity and also China's own geopolitical vulnerabilities. And this leads me to just briefly discuss this idea that's very, very fashionable these days of triangularism and wedging Russia away from China. I think these efforts to revive triangularism are pointless. I think it's delusional to imagine that being more accommodating to Putin will somehow persuade him to loosen ties with Beijing. I think instead it just encourages him to play Western policy makers for suckers and enhances Moscow's strategic leverage. As the great French statesman Talleyrand might have said if he were living in these times, it's worse than a crime, it's a mistake. So I think Western policy should focus on concrete problems rather than indulge in abstractions, authoritarian governance model, rules-based international order, yada, yada. Decision makers also need to be clear about where the real dangers lie in Central and Eastern Europe. Because in Central and this region, it is Russia, not China, which is the primary threat. And recent events have demonstrated this amply. Now, ultimately, if the Western decision makers want to really meet the challenges, address the challenges presented by Russia and China, then they need to do a much better job of demonstrating the effectiveness of liberal values, norms, and institutions. And specifically, that means tackling basic failures of governance and the rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe. It means investing properly in regional infrastructure. It means working more closely with allies and regional partners. And of course, it means responding vigorously and in much more united fashion to outrages such as the Belarus hijacking. I'll leave it there, Mathieu.
Thank you very much, Bobo. And I'm thrilled that you quoted Talleyrand in your presentation. I'll take it as a French compliment. Let me turn over to you, Myra. What does it look like from Moscow's window in a way? What is driving Russia to accommodate, as it is, China in the region and to avoid overstepping their prerogatives or their area of responsibilities? And where does that leave us in the future in managing or co-managing this region? Over to you.
First of all, I really would like to congratulate to Edward and Bobo for this report, because it's really necessary. It is in addition to an excellent analysis and exercise of demystification. In the West fixation on Sino-Russian cooperation, there is a kind of fashion and panic about it. And I think that this report shows that there is a little substantive policy coordination between them. And I think that is really very, very important. Although there is a non-aggression pact between Moscow and Beijing for Russia, which already since the 19th have been its influence limited have seen its influence in region limited by the European Union and the United States, now has to deal with the presence of China. And of course, this is a very annoying for Russia, and Russia is concerned about it. But also, I think that Russia that the Kremlin thinks that the presence of China cannot weaken the influence of Russia. So in this sense, even many analysts said that, above all, for example, about Serbia, that Serbia is a client state of China, or that Serbia is a gateway of China for Europe. Even in this sense, Serbia is one of the most important states for Russia in the Balkans. And in the region, China and Russia are rivalry power. As Bobo said, this is a typical example of the great power competition. And in this sense, I think that the biggest competition from the Russian point of view between the two may develop in the economic field, especially in area of the investment, in which China is winning. But Moscow also can count with huge energy dependence on the countries on the region of the Russia. Coordination between them may exist in the veto in the United Nations Security Council on the recognition of Kosovo and some other diplomatic initiatives. And what is also interesting on the question of soft power, their strategies are the same with respect to the mask diplomacy during the pandemic. We have seen it, but they are completely different on the question of traditional soft power, on culture, language, or religion links in the region. China, for the huge number of citizens, is and exotic power, from its food to its language and Confucianism. Russia is a known and sister power, especially in Serbia, because of historical, religious, and linguistic ties. Ukraine is a case apart, and its rapprochement with China is the consequence of its estrangement from Russia. Political elites would like a practical relationship with China and Russia, but the citizens perceive both countries as a fake. In case of China, for its copies of clothes and luxury goods, and in case of Russia, for disinformation campaigns. To conclude, before I conclude, I would like also to highlight two things. The first one is what I would call the vicious circle of opportunism, that the countries from the region do not have to choose between Moscow or Beijing. Their relationship with them is opportunistic and practical. They use both to balance pressure from Brussels and Washington. Of the two, China is more useful in economic sense, but also Russia is necessary because of energy. And then also we have Russia above all, and all this discourse which Bobo mentioned about possibility of the triangle. Just please forget the Russian card. In this sense, Russia makes propaganda about its strategic cooperation with China, and just said we can harm the United States and the European Union, and if you reject us, we will be every day closer and closer to China. I think that in the near future, the relationship between China and Russia will depend more on their relationship with the United States and European Union than on the dynamic of the relationship between them. So it's very important to highlight it, and I completely agree. I agree with the report completely, but above all with the recommendations that the best way of countering the challenges posed by Russia and China globally, and especially in the Central Europe and East Europe, the Balkans, is to demonstrate that the liberal democracy works. But also, I think that we have not to forget that Russia and China really enjoy to make pure propaganda and disinformation, talking about the possibility to create alternative world order, of course not liberal, and in this sense that they will compete with the United States and the European Union. So I will stop here, just not to waste more time, and we'll be happy to respond to any question. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Myra. I think it's a very cool-headed and objective assessment, so thank you very much for that. Bethany, let me give you the floor. Conversely, what does it look like from Beijing's window in terms of engagement in the region and managing the relationship with Russia? Over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks to all the other co-panelists whose remarks have been very interesting to me, and I'll build on that a little bit. So I want to talk about China's goals in Central and Eastern Europe and how those may be changing. It's been previously mentioned that China and Russia don't necessarily share values so much as interests in the region, and that is most certainly true. China views the Czech Republic, Hungary, especially Baltic states, as a backdoor into Europe, into the EU and into NATO. An example of that would be in the Czech Republic when Huawei was trying to get a security clearance to bid on sensitive infrastructure projects in the Czech Republic, NATO ally, EU member, of course. And if it gets that kind of legitimacy, it can perhaps do that through the rest, that will help justify similar activities in the rest of Europe. A traditional view on China's goals in Europe is that, unlike Russia, Beijing doesn't want to disrupt the EU, doesn't want to split the EU or cause it to collapse. Rather, that its goals are to co-opt and infiltrate and perhaps reshape these institutions for their own interests, which would include expanding economic influence, riches, economic prosperity, and weakening support for human rights and democratic liberal values around the world. I would suggest that while that's most certainly true, I think that is still Beijing's primary motive, apart from just pure economic interests. I think that is Beijing's primary motive in Central and Eastern Europe. But increasingly, I would say we're going to see, and we are seeing, a trend where Beijing is realizing the power of some of Russia's strategies in terms of driving chaos and trying to drive wedges both within societies and within larger institutions. And I'll give a couple of examples of that from various regions. So, China in the past couple of years, previous to a couple of years ago, especially coronavirus, China's didn't really have much in the way of, external disinformation operations. It was more straight propaganda, but we've seen Beijing using Russian-style disinformation increasingly and really dramatically, especially in 2020 and up to 2021, targeted at Taiwan, at Southeast Asia, the United States, Europe, globally during the coronavirus. And some of that messaging was aimed at causing panic inside of, foreign societies and at decreasing confidence in governments. So we see that sense of Beijing trying to drive chaos. Now with the EU, here's something interesting. I think that China really saw the power of driving a wedge between allies with the signing of the EU-China not the signing, but the potential ratification of the EU-China investment agreement, how that was driving a huge wedge between the EU and the US. Now that's fallen apart because China still hasn't figured out how to effectively use wolf warrior diplomacy, and to relate to an EU that is becoming more hawkish on China. But that was a really powerful moment. And as the EU now is pivoting towards a more hawkish view of China, as we have really seen much more dramatically in the past 6 months and especially 3 months, I think that we will see Beijing start to realize the power of paralyzing the EU. And it can use and will use some of its traditional channels of influence in Central and Eastern Europe to do that. And Hungary is a good example of this, that China is very, very willing to actively support the strengthening of authoritarianism in Hungary. And this causes profound paralysis in the EU. Even with EU's direct relations with China, are they going to condemn China's actions or not? Hungary can vote against that. But also, what is the EU going to do with Hungary? What, can it still be in the EU if it's not a democracy? And this kind of inner paralysis is something that really benefits China. And the stronger that its political, diplomatic, and economic ties are to the Czech Republic and to Hungary and to Poland is a great example. The Baltic states. That strengthens Beijing's hand in the EU and in NATO. But there is Beijing is facing some headwinds, and that is actually related in some ways to Russia and to Europe's experience with the former Soviet Union. And that is that there's, unlike, you could say, Southeast Asia or Africa and the Middle East, Europe has a lot of, even though there is a trend towards, the breakdown of democracy there, there's also very, very strong antibodies against communism in a lot of these societies. And the Czech Republic is a perfect example of that you have a strong contingent of people who are like, oh, Communist Party, we've seen this before. We are not doing that. And Lithuania, great example of that as well. There are people there who are, they see what's happening, and they have a playbook. They know what China's going to do. We've been here before, we've done this, and we are not going to do it. And so I think that's something that China has perhaps not understood about the pre-existing circumstances of, when it's trying to enter into these kinds of ties in this region. I have not seen China and Russia working together very effectively. I see more China learning from Russia and also working towards shared interests. And a little bit in some of these countries, you see China working through the really traditional, people who are closer to Russia, borrowing some of the same kinds of people to push their interests locally, but not a lot of very effective partnerships there. And with that, I will leave off.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bethany. I think it was a great assessment, and all these presentations are very complimentary. But let me jump right in terms of the questions, and I'll remind our participants and audience to submit their questions through the Q&A function. But let's discuss the policy implications, right? And specifically, Bobo, I take your point, the pointlessness of the wedge policy and the need to demonstrate an impeccable track record of our own democracies in a way to project a better model. However, I would argue these countries are increasingly less democratic and look less like they want Western values, especially in the Balkans. We mentioned Hungary, for instance.
Yeah.
What if they don't want to become liberal democracies anymore? And what if they do reject these values to side with those who have something different? So in a way, my question would be, can we fear that the region or some parts of the region could sort of become lost in a balancing act increasingly between Russia and China for a different or a better model, and less like they're siding with Europe and the United States and NATO for that matter? And therefore a tipping point where a greater Russian-China presence would endanger our very own model and what we are projecting there. And beyond that, what must we do, right? Lest we drive wedges, what do we do to counter the influx of information manipulation that Bethany presented, for instance? Also, what do we do with the European model that is projecting economic clout? Yes, but it looks like it has a really hard time selling its civilizational model anymore. God knows how complicated it is in Brussels these days. So overall, what beyond the what do we do? What do we do? Bobo, okay. I'll let you start, and I'll ask everyone in turn.
Okay, sure, fine. Look, we need to remember that the reason that the West won the Cold War wasn't because democracy or liberalism or capitalism was inherently more virtuous than communism and statist economics. The West won the Cold War because its system of governance, its approach to government and to people and society was so much more effective as well as humane. And the problem that liberal democracy, or the so-called liberal model, has had over the last particularly 10 to 15 years is we are not making the case that our model is more effective, gives people a better life than, say, the Chinese model, because people still have an idealized conception of the China model. In fact, there have been multiple China models over the years. So the notion of a China model is nonsensical in itself. But what we have to do is to show that liberal democracy works much better than any of the alternatives, for all its faults. And we have not been able to demonstrate that. And what the Chinese and Russia, especially the Chinese, have been able to do is to say, look, Western capitalism doesn't work. This so-called liberal rules-based order is a nonsense. Look at us. We have been more effective. We have grown. We are more humane. We send aid around the world. We participate more in UN peacekeeping. We have handled the coronavirus much more effectively. We are developing renewable energy very quickly. Now, a lot of this is, of course, misleading, if not downright lies. But the thing is, they've been able to sell an image of China as more effective than the West. Now, the West needs to demonstrate that that is not so. So it's not merely about countering Chinese disinformation and propaganda. It's actually showing that the West that Western liberal democracy is truly effective. And that's what I meant. Hence the first of my recommendations about demonstrating the effectiveness of liberal values and institutions. We have to tackle basic failures of governance and the rule of law. And by the way, I mentioned in Central and Eastern Europe, but we also have to challenge basic failures of governance and the rule of law in Western Europe and in the United States. Trump was an absolute disaster, not because of the physical effects of his policy, but because it discredited the very idea of American moral leadership. And it also showed that the United States wasn't merely amoral, or it seemed to be that way, but also inept. It's what Brzezinski talked about in when he described the Iraq invasion as suicidal statecraft. I mean, that's the problem. We need to be better at what we do. We need to outcompete and outperform the Chinese. And if we're not prepared to do that, if we're not really prepared to put our money where our mouth is, then we've got no chance.
Thank you, Bobo. A strong message and a strong warning for us to actually act and do something. Edward, do you want to jump in on that?
Yes, I agree with what Bobo said. I think we should also say to the Chinese Communist Party, please continue with your wolf warrior tactics.
Absolutely.
They're incredibly helpful. I run a weekly bulletin called the China Influence Monitor, which is a sort of roundup of counterproductive Chinese, or it's a roundup of Chinese activities in the sort of what we call the westward footprint. And when I started a year ago, I was a bit worried that I would be hard to find material. And every week we find some Chinese diplomat somewhere doing something really stupid and counterproductive. The latest is, maybe it's an official media outlet or something. So this week, the Global Times has told the Lithuanians, watch out, you're in a very dangerous part of the world. You're a very complicated geopolitical situation. Don't rock the boat, which is exactly as Mira was saying earlier, exactly the wrong thing. Well, no, it's Bethany was saying earlier, exactly the wrong thing to say, watch out, communists will come and get you. And again and again, what seems like an effective divide and rule tactic, or the infrastructure, weaponized infrastructure, sort of collapses because of a tone deaf approach to the countries they're dealing with, and often very bad implementation. So if you look at the infrastructure projects, I remember when these first started, when China was building a motorway in Poland, everyone was saying, oh my goodness, China builds motorways really well in China. Now they're coming to Eastern Europe and they're going to build lots of motorways and with murky financing, but it'll be cheap and they're very quick. And and 20 years on, that motorway in Poland was a disaster. The road to nowhere in Montenegro is a disaster. The Budapest to Belgrade railway is still not being built. The smokestack investments in Serbia aroused tremendous environmental worries. And again, we just see them kind of taking a gun and blasting away at their own feet. So I don't want to say they may not learn from this, and it would worry me a lot that through some Darwinian process they start working out this doesn't work, so let's try something that does. But so far, I think they are presenting a barn door sized target for their critics, which makes life a bit easier for us, and we should appreciate that.
Thank you, Edwards. Myra, Bethany, do you want to jump on that as well, on the wider policy implications? Myra, please.
Yes, I just want to say that I was born in a communist country in former Yugoslavia, and what was very attractive for us when we talk about the international liberal order is that we think that this order really works. And in West world, you have been talking about freedom non-stop, full-time job. You have been talking about freedom. Now I really miss this discourse about freedom, and what Bethany said about the communism. We have communism experience and we don't like it. This is the first point. And second is that what Bethany said about the paralysis of the European Union because of China, I completely agree, but also I think that is a consequence, not only because China is great, but also because the European Union abandoned one time this part of the world, and the geopolitics is like physics. No, somebody just come and fulfill the vacuum, and that is what happened in the Balkans. So for the West, I think that we have to what should concern us most in the region is not this partnership without substance, but the cumulative power of Russian and Chinese influence, which supports the non-democratic governments in the region, albeit separately. And paradoxically, this Chinese and Russian strategy really fit in some way with the attitude of the European Union in its support of the stabilitocracia, the support, for example, of the populist government of Alexander Vučić in Serbia, because it's some kind of guarantees of the stability, very important also, but this combination of Chinese and Russian influence and stabilitocracy is completely, really very, very bad context for any democratic development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bethany, do you want to comment as well? Or?
Sure, and I'm going to speak a little bit US-centric because I'm in America, I am American, and I just know it better, but I think these are, what I'm going to say is also going to be pretty widely applicable to some European countries. You know, if you look at, you know, during the Cold War, you know, which side won and the messaging that we you know, were able to put out, and also the values we were able to present, as Mira said, you know, our discussion of freedom and what freedom means. Some of those realities don't exist anymore, or they exist in a very degraded form because of our own internal policy choices. Again, speaking very much of the US, you know, the way that we have changed our economy, the structure of our economy to highly privilege wealth and wealthy elites. And that has, you know, reduced the ability of middle-class people, lower-class people to participate in government, to believe that the government speaks for them. It has reduced the ability of the government to more effectively make sure that people live, you know, that the socioeconomic divide isn't so great, has reduced the ability of the government to just sort of actively govern. Very, very true in the US. And I think that that is a kind of degradation of our politico-economic system that has had very profound social consequences, you know, and we could have, you know, 18,000 hours of discussion about the rise of Trump and the rise of populism and all the reasons for that. But basically, I would say that it's kind of this, you know, belief that the government shouldn't be involved in things, but you're basically, you know, giving all this power to people who are privately wealthy. I think that that is something that has been deeply, deeply harmful to the West. And that is something that China has really been able to capitalize on, both in terms of how it's able to influence our societies by just simply offering money, you know, and opportunities to the people who are most influential in our politics and in our government. And also with the messaging to say that, like, you're not, you know, you are not able to do these things. Democratic countries their governments are not able to take swift and sweeping action to address global crises. You're not able to, you know, deal with these larger social problems. And I think that, you know, the reason those messages resonate genuinely is because they're partially true. Now, that's not to say that China actually has a better model, and that's where the propaganda and the lies and the censorship comes in. But, you know, as has previously been said, we have to make sure our governments and our democratic polities are actually working. And if we can do that, you know, and fix a lot of these structural problems, even the messaging problem is partially a result of this. Again, I'm a journalist, right? I know a lot about structural problems in journalism. One of those is because a lot of it has, you know, there's economic problems that affect the quality of journalism, and it's become so cutthroat that it's very hard for us to promote positive messages about our own governments, even when our own governments do positive things. We have some of these social ills that we have to fight ourselves. And I think a positive view of this is that I do actually believe democratic societies are good at doing this, good at recognizing problems and fixing them, because we're allowed to talk about them freely and we don't get put in jail for doing that. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism in the long run, that right now China can seem very scary and Russia, you know, not that anyone really admires how Russia governs itself, but the way that it supports authoritarianism abroad. There's a lot of long-term reason for optimism, because I do believe democratic societies, if they can preserve the ability to to have a responsive governance and discussion, are going to be better long-term at fixing their domestic problems. So my policy recommendations would be for governments to focus on economic issues domestically.
Thank you, Bethany. Bobo, you have a raised hand, which is a 2 fingers, but very quickly, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, picking up on Mira and Bethany's points about opportunism. Let's not pretend that China and Russia have undermined the liberal international order when the liberal international order would have otherwise been perfectly functional. What they have done is exploit the weaknesses and shortcomings, ineptitude of this system and of the states and state actors that make up this system. That has been the problem. And now this doesn't make them nicer people, but it's a perfectly understandable and rational response to perceived weakness.
Thank you, Bobo. Let me group 3 questions that we have that are really discussing the impact on Europe. So what is, in a way, the impact of all these discussions concerning Central and Eastern Europe on the wider European security and interest? I'm thinking also of the transatlantic link and Brussels as a model or a lighthouse in a way. And conversely, how is the EU reacting to the growing presence of China and Russia? And the corollary would be, will discussions of European strategic autonomy become increasingly prominent as Europe also needs to frontline on these issues that are turning potentially in the military and security realm? So what should and what must Europe do in a way to ensure its prevailing model and to remain a model in the region? Who wants to take that first? Mira, please. Yeah,
maybe just a part is a very complicated question. Just few remarks. The first one is that there is a very different approach among the European countries toward China, because it is not the same commercial interest, it's not the same political interest, and so on. So I think that generally speaking, that the European countries are in the process of the wake up. And we have seen what happened at the end of the last year when at the end of the German presidency, the European Union signed the comprehensive agreement of investment with China. But after when China has forbidden the entrance of the members of European Parliament, the European Union said maybe it is not such a good idea. No? So I think that strategic autonomy is now in the point that with the Biden presidency, the European Union is prepared to make some concessions to the US about China in change of the more close transatlantic relationship. But this is very complex, and I said, as always, the huge problem of the European Union is that the lack of the common vision between the member states. And about the Balkan and East and Central Europe and the presence of Russia and China, just one remark that the European Union now try to invest more money and to be more present, to have a more presence there. But I think that all of us is very conscious that Europe does not have has a narrative about it, does not have a discourse about it. And what Bethany said, the EU is in a state of paralysis. It's a very complex question. I just put these two remarks.
Thank you, Mara. Bobo, Edward, do you want to, Bethany? Go ahead, Bobo, please.
Yeah, look, whenever I hear the expression strategic autonomy, I must say I'm always confused what it actually means. You know, how autonomous, how strategic, and you know, the cynic in me sort of thinks, well, you know, I see these terms like rules-based international order, burden sharing, strategic autonomy, and I sort of the cynic in me thinks that these have become sort of mantras, increasingly devoid of meaning. I mean, are the Europeans really prepared to put out, to really take Biden seriously? Or are they thinking, oh, great, Trump is gone, we can just go back to the status quo ante? And while some might deny this, I rather suspect that in practice, many Europeans are going to be thinking, it'll be like Obama 3, you know, happy days. So this is what worries me. I absolutely concur with Mira about and Bethany about the sort of EU paralysis. But I sort of see the Europeans wanting to be a little bit independent of Biden, but they still depend strategically on the United States. There is no way around this. And while they're taking geopolitical and security priorities more seriously, let's be honest, the EU is a geopolitical pygmy.
Thank you, Bobo. Edward, Bethany, do you have a few words on that? Edward, yes, please.
I think this is just, it's true, it's worth repeating that we have to deal with the EU we have rather than the EU we'd like to have. I think that there's a kind of, and I'm not getting at France particularly here, but there's an idea that, oh, America wants to drag us into a new Cold War with China. We must resist. That's not in our interest. And Europeans say that, but unfortunately, it's a bit like, I think was it Lenin or Trotsky said, you may not be interested in us, but we are interested in you. That China sets these very binary divides. You either use cotton from Xinjiang and do it joyfully, or you face a boycott. You either turn up to the Olympics and do that joyfully, or you face punishment. You either boycott Taiwan and do that joyfully, or so they set these very tough binary tests. And if you fail them, then you're on the outside. And I think that sort of pushes countries towards being in de facto saying, well, we're going to get whacked by the PRC. So that really means we are in the American camp, even if we don't instinctively want to be there. So I go back to what I said earlier. I think that China is helping clarify, or the Chinese Communist Party is helping clarify the situation a bit.
Bethany, please.
Sure, and I'll jump in with just sort of a modest suggestion I think the EU is very capable of, and that is making China feel the effects of its actions in supporting authoritarianism. And here's an example. So, we're just dealing with this, big shock of the, Belarus hijacking a civilian plane to get this journalist off of it. Now, China is very, very directly involved in this. How? Out two ways, just generally making the world safer for authoritarianism and this kind of extraterritorial kidnapping, which it has done quite frequently, although without a lot of media coverage, but also because a Chinese national is the head of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. So, if China is going to do what it does, which is act in really rash ways, but do it in a less a smarter way than Lukashenko just did, or to make it easier for countries to do this, I think the EU can, just through diplomacy and through public statements, hold China not responsible, but say, look, you helped create this mess. We're going to very publicly say that you are responsible for finding a problem, or you have to work with us to find a problem. To kind of say that, like, look, it's Beijing right now still views itself very much as an underdog, in the same way that Russia does, which is to say, we don't like the current system. Without really, I think that especially, leaders in Beijing have not really thought, if they achieve what they want, the kind of weight that they will have to bear, because China has repeatedly, said it does not want that kind of responsibility. It said, we want all the benefits of a kind of hegemonic ability to guarantee all interests, but we don't want those responsibilities. And I think if the EU and the US can work together to say, oh, you want these benefits, well, you're going to have to deal with the responsibilities too. I think that could help in a very productive way show Beijing that some of its actions are not creating a world that it even wants.
Thank you, Bethany, and really good point on Belarus's air piracy. And it actually takes us back to Bobo's point and focus in on actual problems, not the idealized ones that we might have concerning Russia-China. Let's go back with a question from the audience concerning the 17+1 format. So, and I'll read. The report notes that the relationship between countries in CEE and China is very one-sided. How do we explain the importance China appears to give to the 17+1 formats and the pressure exerted on the various heads of government and states to represent their country at annual gatherings of the forum? Edward, I see you're ready to answer.
Well, see, I don't think it does actually give that much importance to 17+1. One person we spoke to said that China the PRC would happily sacrifice the entire 17+1 for better relations with one of the German federal states like Bavaria or North Rhine-Westphalia, because that's what really matters. And someone said earlier that the Eastern Europe is a back door. Well, the good thing about a back door is that you don't need it if you've got the front door. And I think that the reason, and there isn't a systematic divide and rule policy being played through the 17+1. It just isn't. It isn't effective. It's not getting China what it wants on that. It's not actually getting them, significant commercial contracts or anything like that. It doesn't really do very much, except in possibly this very long-term idea of building up contacts. And we kept on coming across these funny little sort of offices, like there's a 17+1 office for logistics in Riga, and there's a 17+1 office for, I think, culture in Macedonia, and there's probably other ones, and there's meant to be a 17+1 network of think tanks, except their website's broken, and there's a 17+1, I can't remember, pharmaceuticals or something. So they set these things up, and maybe in their world of very, very long-term things, they're taking sort of intern level people off or early career people off to China and giving them a tour and building up the contacts. And who knows, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But in terms of sort of active, real stuff happening now, it's not terribly effective. And they don't put tremendous weight on it. There's a sort of, spats of temper when if you sort of publicly disrespectful to the 17+1, but in the end nothing happens. Nothing's happened to the Czech Republic. Nothing's actually happened to Lithuania. Nothing. The discipline is really quite weak. So I feel that it's a, to use a famous Maoist phrase, I think the 17+1 is a bit of a paper tiger. Really, it becomes important if we make it important, and if the Lithuanians and others say, well, actually, what, doesn't really matter. Well, in the end, I think not very much happens. And I would just very briefly say that I think what's much more important in a way is making a success of the 3 Cs initiative. If the 3 Cs initiative gets more members, does real money, has big projects, gets connectivity actually happening on the ground, which it should do, given that we are closer, richer, more effective, all the rest of it, then I think the 17+1's history.
Thank you, Edward. So it's all about the performativity of the existence and the existence you want to give to the institutions, of course. We have about 5 minutes left. So let me ask you a sort of crystal ball gazing question. If we project ourselves in 15, 20 years in the region, what could change this partnership without substance, as you titled your paper, into a partnership with substance? And where does that leave us moving forward in 15, 20 years? Who wants to take it first?
I'll go first. I'd say the main thing would be disengagement. If the EU and the US just say, oh, not our business, I think Russia and China will be able to do whatever they want there. So we have to keep engaging.
Bobo, please. Yeah.
I think there's an interesting scenario where, if you imagine Chinese foreign policy being a little bit more adept, more skillful than what it is today. So they make fewer of the mistakes that Edward was describing, that they show a little bit of strategic balance and perspective. They get better at what they're doing, but they're no less ambitious. So we have a more increasingly globalist and ambitious, but also a more sophisticated Chinese foreign policy. And in the meantime, Russia continues to decline. It becomes this still strong actor in some respects, but quite weak in many other respects. And the Chinese gradually feel that they can maybe have to be not so careful with Russia, that they can be a little bit more strategically ambitious in Central and Eastern Europe. Why that's interesting is not just for Central and Eastern Europe and for the European continent, but also for the Russia-China relationship, because then the Russians would say, hold on, we are really becoming strategically marginalized by an increasingly globalist China. And then that will create tensions within the Sino-Russian relationship that are not particularly evident today.
If I could just
Thank
jump
you,
in,
quickly,
I
yeah,
think
just a
very
few
quickly, the place to watch would be Central Asia, because
Yes,
if there's going to be friction, it'll be there first. That's where
Absolutely.
China has territorial claims. That's where China has the beginnings of a military base with this weird sort of police frontier thing in Tajikistan. This is where they've got a real debt diplomacy squeeze again on Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. That's where their energy diplomacy has had real effects with the pipelines to Turkmenistan. There's real stuff happening. Now, there's been absolutely no friction so far with Russia. Russia said, great, we have formal relations between the BRI and the East Asian, whatever it is, Eurasian Economic Union. But if there's going to be friction, it'll be there. And if there's going to be closer ties, then I think again you will see it'll be on the very practical side, more on energy, more on nuclear power, possibly more on payments clearing, possibly some sort of sanctions busting digital currency or something like that. But I would focus very, very closely on the practicalities rather than on the rhetoric, because rhetoric is really cheap.
Point taken. Yeah, Myra, please. Yeah, go ahead. Just one sentence that I agree with Edward that the competition will not increase will increase in Central Asia and even in Latin America, Africa, Middle East before than in the East and Central Europe. And but for the countries of this region, if the West will not increase its presence there, China and Russia will increase their accumulative power and their influence. So the West really have to react.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Myra. And a huge thanks to all our panelists. I think it was a great analysis, but also a sort of grim harbinger of things to come. So definitely a lot to watch in the region and beyond for European and transatlantic security. Let's stop there. Thank you very much again. And thank you to our audience for your brilliant questions. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe. And I look forward to welcoming you soon.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.